Beautiful. All right, let's get going. Coming in. So, yeah, the plan and the topic for today is properties. But before we kind of launch directly into this topic, I want to talk to you a little bit about actually what we're going to do for this week and the 2 weeks after. So the way to kind of come at what we're going to be talking about today, next Tuesday, and then the Tuesday after that is actually by thinking about two related distinctions. And the first distinction is one that occurs in language. So it's a kind of linguistic or syntactic even distinction. And that's one we've talked a little bit about before, which is a subject-predicate distinction. So in English, and in fact in many, many, many natural languages, the kind of fundamental sentential construction unit involves having a subject and then something predicated of that subject, right? The simplest version is having something like a name and then a predicate attached to it. And depending on the language, the predicate might include something like this copula, right, an is, to kind of attach the term to a singular, to the name, right? So Socrates is wise, you have the subject of Socrates, and you have the predicate is wise. Not all languages work like this, but many, many, many natural languages do. And in fact, we encoded something like this distinction into our first-order logic, right? First-order logic is based off this idea, because the fundamental unit in FOL is a predicate and a term. So there's a linguistic distinction here between subject terms and predicate terms, predicates and subject terms. So there's a linguistic distinction. Corresponding or related to somehow is what we might think of as a metaphysical distinction. And that's between objects and properties. So objects are things, particulars, individuals. If you go back to the set theory stuff, right, the elementa, the things that we start the set theoretic process with, these are objects. Socrates, Tilburg, the number 42, the null set, my fireplace, each one of us, right? The whole world, whatever the hell that is, right? All of these are objects in some sense. The important thing when we think about them from a linguistic perspective is they're things that are picked out by or purported to be picked out by singular terms, names or definite descriptions. In terms of first-order logic, they're the kinds of things that we would name, right? The things that would be in our domain. So that's roughly objects, right? Things, stuff. Contrast that with properties. Properties are like the way things are, or their qualities, or attributes, or they're what's shared between objects, the resemblances between objects. So this is stuff like is wise or wisdom, redness or is red, loves, right? Relations are going to be properties in some sense. Is a member of. And the important thing linguistically is these are often thought to be denoted by or referred to by predicates. And if we think back to our first order logic, well, we literally had a massive syntactic difference, right? We had the capital letters to express them, and they were picked out by their extensions. So we even had the kind of something like this metaphysical distinction hard encoded into the way we structured for FOL. And what we're going to do for the next basically 3 weeks is think a little bit about these two distinctions. So the linguistic one, the subject-predicate, and its corresponding, again, we'll call it metaphysical distinction between objects and properties. So in particular, what we're going to do is, today we're going to start off by thinking effectively about all the stuff about properties. So our big concern is going to be, what the hell are properties, if there are such things, and should, whatever they are, be included in our ontology in some way. And if not, what can we then say about what's going on with all these predicates? So a good story for an account of properties is going to answer this kind of ontological account, tell us what's going on the property side, and also tell us something about predicates. Yeah?
Some of them can actually be sort of both.
Yeah.
So for example, Socrates as an object, which we also have a Socratic dialogue.
Good. So we have, but note important, when we think about Socratic dialogue, we mean like Socrates. Right? So that isn't, it's using his name, but to help us characterize a predicate. I was thinking you were going to go the other way. So one of the things you'll note here is this is actually a subject term. Redness is a noun, right? Contrast that with is wise, or wisdom, or humanity, right? These ones are all things that seem to express properties. So we'll come back to that in a few more slides, right? But again, these are kind of rough and ready to get us going. So our talk today is going to be about properties, and the idea of should we include them in our ontology, and if we do, what could they be? But this distinction that we just talked about, these two distinctions that we just talked about, are lurking in the background. And then next week, so next Tuesday, what we're going to do is turn to think about the relationship between objects and singular terms. So the topic is going to be, how do singular terms denote or refer to individual objects? So we have the name Tilburg. How does Tilburg refer to this place? What's the kind of mechanism that's going on relating a name to an object? Clearly does, but how? So we'll talk about that on Tuesday. And then the Tuesday after that, so a week and a half, give or take, we're going to think about the metaphysical question, come back to what objects are. And our focus there is basically going to be on identity. Right? So we talked a little bit about how identity works in FLL, but what we're really going to focus on is something like the metaphysical underpinnings of it. When are two objects identical? When are they distinct? How does identity work? And this is going to link again this kind of subject-predicate distinction, this linguistic distinction, and this ontological one, right? Or metaphysical one. So that's basically in the background. But what I'd like specifically to do today is to start off by first giving you a kind of pitch on what properties are meant to be. Right? The kind of basic idea. Along with it, I want to introduce you to a few fundamental distinctions, some of which you probably encountered already, but it doesn't hurt to hear them again, that are lurking in the background of a lot of these debates. So that'll be the first section. And then I want to go through the three arguments that are often trotted out for the existence of properties, why we should believe in them. So this was in the reading. And then we'll talk about, once we've kind of got a case for the existence of properties, we'll look at two forms of realism about properties. That is, two views that buy into their existence. One that's roughly Platonic, and one that's roughly, very roughly, Aristotelian. I suspect you've encountered the Platonic one before. I imagine you've talked about it maybe with David, maybe even the Aristotelian one too. So those will be hopefully a little familiar. And then we'll wrap up by talking about nominalism. So nominalism is the view that rejects the existence of properties. There are no such things as properties. We're only going to get by with objects, individuals. And the trick with nominalism is, how do we make sense of all of the things properties are meant to do for us? So that's the plan. That's what I'd like to try and cover today. I'd like to get through as much of it as we can. Before launching in entirely, ask, yeah?
But are properties then subject, predicate, and the object, or is that the question that the nominalism is talking about? Because
so basically, properties are going to be the thing expressed by the bit in blue.
okay, so not object property. Okay.
So basically what we have is, we have two distinctions, right? We have the linguistic distinction where we have the subject and the predicate. And then there's a corresponding metaphysical distinction between objects, things, and properties, whatever the hell those are.
Okay. Then I understand. Okay.
And our realist says properties exist and they're like this. Our nominalist says properties don't exist. And instead we can just make do with objects. And their trick is going to be, then what the hell is going on with this bit of language? How do we make sense of that? That's going to be the big challenge for the nominalist. Okay. Good question. Okay, so before we dive straight in, I forgot to ask already, how do you want to run the session? Do you want to go for a bit and break? Does that sound good? Okay, so we'll aim to get to around 9:30, give or take, and then we'll take our 10 minutes and come back. All right? I expect that will put us, hopefully that'll put us right at the beginning of 3, maybe somewhere into it. We'll just see how it goes. Obviously, if I'm on a rant and you want to stop, just throw your hands up. Like, please, God, save us. Okay, so properties, the basic idea. So here's a laundry list of the sorts of things properties are meant to be or meant to do. Right? Properties are meant to be entities that can be predicated. That is, they can be applied to things. Right? So redness, if it's an entity, is something that can be predicated of fire trucks and my sweater. Right? And actually, there aren't very many genuinely red apples, but the stereotypical red apple. Right? Valentine's Day hearts. Right? These kinds of things. Redness can be predicated of them. It can be applied to them. Similarly, properties are meant to be things like attributes, or qualities, features, characteristics, types. So being a tiger looks like something like a property. There are multiple instances of tiger. Here's Tony. Here's Tigger. Here's, what's another famous tiger? I can't think of any. Shere Khan. But that's digging real deep. So properties are ways things are. That is, this thing is fragile. If I threw it hard enough on the ground, it would shatter. So fragility looks like a way that this thing is. Related to this notion of predication, properties are meant to be entities that things exemplify or instantiate. Courageousness, or ingenious, beloved of the gods. Again, things that you instantiate. And finally, coming back to our opening thing, properties are often thought to be what predicates denote or express. Or if not the whole predicate, then at least what we might think of as a general term. So we have something like, hey, this fire engine's red. This apple's red. My sweater is red. Awesome. So the is red here. What's that expressing? It's expressing the property of redness. Again, these are super duper rough and ready, and what we're going to try and do is characterize them a bit more as we go, but this is roughly what properties are meant to be or meant to do. And notably, what properties are, and if there are any such things, is, honest to God, a massive, central, and long-running debate in Western philosophy. And not just Western philosophy. But it's certainly something that, if we're coming from a tradition that likes to say we're stemming from the Greeks, something they were very interested in. Plato's answer to these questions about what properties are is informative for his whole view about everything. His epistemology, his theory of justice, his theory of society is in fact driven by his views about the nature of properties. Which is kind of crazy, but it is what it is. Right? So these are what properties are meant to be. And what we're going to try and think about is again, these kind of questions. What they might be metaphysically, let's cash them out in some more substantive terms, and whether we really should believe that there are any such things. Because this is a pretty damn big laundry list of jobs. So in order to do this debate, I want to walk through a few distinctions. Again, some of which you've probably already seen, but it doesn't hurt to just make sure that we're all on the same page. So let's start with our first one. and ask a very silly question. How many letters are in my little teal box here? I mean, there's at least two good answers, right? So there's a plausible case to be made to say there's four, A, and B. And there's a plausible case to be made for two. There's A and there's B. And it happened to have two instances of both, but there's really only two letters there. Can we see the flip between those two readings? So what are we doing when we're doing that flip? We're flipping between thinking about the letters in terms of types or the letters in terms of tokens. So a type is basically a kind or a form, something that you can have multiple examples of. So if we think about counting in terms of type, there's just two letters in the box. There's A and there's B. Contrast that with thinking about tokens. Tokens are particular instances. So if we think about the tokens of letters in the box, there's four. Two tokens of A, two tokens of B. Now, it sounds very silly, but having this ability to distinguish between, hey, did you mean types or did you mean tokens, is incredibly useful. Because there will be very, very, very silly cases where you flip back and forth. This is going to be sort of sad sounding. Hold on. But one of the things Amanda and I like to joke about is eating pears. How many pears is one eating if you eat a pear? Well, if you just eat one, then you're not eating a full pear, you're eating half a pear. But, everyone knows what I mean when I talk about pear. The fruit pear. It's a really dumb joke. Don't worry about it if it's confusing. Yeah.
So type was 2 and token was 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So type is again the kind, right? Whereas token is the number of particular instances. So you might think of like a really good zoo should have variants in type and a lot of tokens of each type. Be like, oh, we got like 10,000 animals. Cool, you just have like a ton of squirrels. Not a very exciting zoo, unless you're really into squirrels. Yeah, fair dues. But most people go to zoos expecting variance in type, more than just variance in token. So again, type has to do with the generalized number, the kind. Token is this particular individual instances. So this kind of distinction comes up when we think about stuff like, say, physicalism debates in philosophy of mind. You might want to talk about particular token mental events or particular token mental properties, like this person's pain, or you might want to talk about pain in general, the type. So this distinction will come back. A related but distinct distinction has to do with determinants and determinables. Now, I suspect you might not have come across this before, but the basic idea is fairly easy to grasp. A determinant is a general kind, and a determinable are the subtypes or the subkinds. So, for example, color is determinable. Red, green, blue, yellow, etc. are determinants. So a determinable is a kind of broad, general way you could be, and a determinant is one of the particular ways to be that thing. Being in the room, and then exactly where you're located. That's the kind of relation. Yeah.
Can you relate this to set theory, like sets, that's a determinant, and then the subsets are the determinables?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, that's one way to cash out this distinction. So another case, shape is determinable. It can be determined. And then determinants are the particular shapes that one individual has, right? This thing's square. This thing's a triangle. This thing's a circle, right? All of these determinants are different ways to be. Yeah.
I think determinants and determinables are flipped
add the 3 sentences there.
It could be. I did these when I was very sick, so.
Fair.
No, I don't think that's right, but I'll double check to make sure. So importantly, the determinable is a way that you can be to determine, and determinate is the way that it actually comes through.
Maybe the above sentence is flipped.
It could well be that I flipped all of them. I gotta check. But again, the core idea is what we have is a general type versus the particular. Yeah.
But that shows, like the last sentence, that there is a possibility for a determinant to be determined.
Good. So note, what we always have is it's a relation between two things, but it can keep going. So a determinant could have subdeterminants. Right? Red is a determinant of color, but then each shade of red is going to be a further specification. Effectively, what this tells us is you have something like a tree. You've got color at the top, and then you have all the various colors. I'm just going to put red and green, say. And then underneath these, you'll have subdeterminants. Crimson, maroon, chartreuse, whatever, right? I've kind of exhausted all of my red cherry. So when we're thinking about this relationship, it's always just between two elements, and then there might be further breakdowns as we go along. Yes?
So to clarify, the determinant is the general type and the determinable is the subtype? Or is it?
I think it's the way I have it here, right? So determinable is one that can be specified. Determinant is the specification. I think that's right, but I'll double check because now the skepticism has been introduced, I'm not 100% sure. Yeah.
So you could also say the determinant, like it has color, and then the determinable, it is red.
Yeah. Again, kind of narrowing it down. Yeah. So the power set of color would effectively be all of the different ways you could determine color, right? And then each subset would be a determinant.
Red would be one subset of it, which turns, and then
Exactly.
there's another subset of color.
Exactly, right? So our formal tools, the stuff that we've talked about before, immediately relate back to this notion. Nice. Okay. So these are our first two. I want to talk about two more. The second one is one I'm sure you've come across. Right? Maybe not in these terms, but the third one here is this difference between what we'll call abstract versus concrete entities. Now, have you guys run across this notion before, this distinction before? So we can kind of give a rough and ready idea here. Right? Concrete entities are things that are located in space and time. A jokey way to think about it is they pass the Q-tip test. That is, you can kick them. Right? They're somewhere around, they're in principle kickable. You guys don't know a Tribe Called Quest, I guess. That's fine, right? So Q-tip asks, can I kick it? And the answer is, yes, you can. So, concrete entities are somewhere out there in space and time. They can feature in, or they must feature in, depending on your views, causal relationships. Either they cause things or they are caused. They can in principle be perceived. Note the in principle's importance because there might be issues about how far away they are, or how small or how big they are. Right? But there's some kind of perception that might be related to them. And notably, they're mutable. They can change. Not all of them, necessarily, but at least in principle they can. Contrast concrete entities with abstracta. Abstract entities aren't located in space and time. They don't stand in causal relations. Right? They exist, but they exist in some other place. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. They can't be directly perceived, or at least it's typically thought they can't be directly perceived. And they're non-mutable. They're unchanging and eternal. Or at least, again, typically.
So is language an abstract entity?
That's a tough question, right? So what we might think of is there's a difference between language and language, right? As in, there's the kind of thing that we're doing right now, the concrete entity that is the complex sequences of sounds and structures of symbols and things. That's concrete. And then there's this kind of abstract entity that's basically governed by, say, a bunch of rules and things like this. And that's an abstract object.
How is talking concrete?
Oh, I mean, it's causal, it's spatially temporally located, it involves sound waves.
Vibrations.
Yeah, exactly. It's vibrations in your ears.
And writing, that's also concrete.
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean,
Yeah.
all of it's just marks on a page or something like this. So what you might think of, here's a way to kind of get at it, right? Think about translation, right? If you think that what you can do is translate a work, what you're really saying is that the thing that you're translating, the work, is an abstract object that can be embodied in this language or embodied in this language.
Okay. So the language itself is concrete, but you can change it. So
Maybe what's being expressed is somehow abstract, right?
the meaning like that.
Yeah, that's something we're going to talk about next week. So we might think the meaning here is not language dependent.
Okay.
Again, language is a tough one. Another really interesting example for trying to pull these apart is numbers, right? Numbers might be a case where we have abstract objects, right? The number 2 might be embodied if we have 2, right? I've got my phone and my coffee cup, so I've got 2 things in my hand, but I don't have the number 2 in my hand. The number 2, if it is anything, is plausibly going to be this abstract entity. It's often some kind of weird non-spatial temporal place.
If I write it on a board, as I did with colors.
So what we want to differentiate here is the numeral, the symbol that we use to refer to it, from the thing referred to. Right? Just like if I wrote Vim, I can write dirty things about him, which I'm not gonna because they're filming me. So this is basically just a name, a symbol that represents. It is not the thing itself. At least that's the thought. Right? Again, we might push and pull here, but as long as we get roughly the difference here. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a stupid question, but what about time? Because you can't kick it, but it's, I don't know.
Yeah. So space and time look kind of weird here, right? Because, well, space and time don't seem to really exist in each other, at least not in any kind of concrete way. So what we might think is that these distinctions really only apply to entities, right? Things, rather than maybe manifolds or exactly what time and space are is a bit tough to crack, right? Yeah. The distinction isn't necessarily going to apply across the board.
But if you say, like in sports block, and you are referring to a certain time, but you aren't actually stating the real time.
I mean, what we might think of there is we could relate that back to something like a location relative to the sun, relative to everyone else on Earth, something like this. Actually, I think if we're being really strict, it's relative to Greenwich. Because the fucking British, ruin everything. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so it says that it can be perceived, can principle be perceived.
In principle.
Yeah, but so I was thinking about these examples of, for instance, radiation and all these things that are actually only perceived by, well, apparatus that we make. So we don't know for sure because, there's an argument of theory lightness in the things that we find that they're only proven because we believe the theory that it proves that it exists. And we don't know for sure if we actually measure these things.
Yeah.
Because we need these things. Are those in the concrete or in the abstract?
They would be in the concrete, right? So the thought would be if there's like these little teeny tiny particles and they're really out there, they're going to be concrete entities. So the kind of in principle is really doing the heavy lifting here, right? Because the same thing is going to be with like, look, it's pretty much guaranteed there are stars that are outside of our light cone, so there's no way we could ever causally interact with them, but there's a sense in which they're perceivable in some way. So that's the same kind of idea, right? And note again, these aren't meant to be necessary and sufficient conditions. They're rough and ready guides to this difference. If there's really one that pulls them apart, it's this top one. Having spatial location or spatial temporal location versus not. Yeah.
So is this the Platonic separation of the phenomenological world and the world of ideas?
Very close to it, right? So the world of ideas are going to be this stuff,
Yeah.
like abstract. And this is going to be the phenomenological world, right? The world of senses, the world of things.
So you can see this in a Platonic manner.
It is very close to Plato.
Okay.
We don't want to necessarily map it perfectly to Plato because he's got some nuances and doesn't quite line up.
Like the ideas come to the phenomenological world. So
Yeah. This is very similar to the Platonic distinction.
Yeah. Okay.
The one other thing to note here is there's a kind of funny thing, which I'm interested nobody picked up on, right? Is that, note this qualification. Abstract entities are not mental entities. They're not objects in our heads. Because, strictly speaking, if they're in our heads, they're in space. They're in there. So the realm of the mental, if that even really kind of makes sense, isn't going to be the realm of abstracta. This is something different. In fact, Frege, as we'll talk about next Tuesday, Frege very unhelpfully decided to call the realm of the abstracta the third realm, which isn't so good because he's German. So you can guess what that was called. Yeah, exactly. Right. Admittedly, he was writing way before that happened, but still, not a good association. So we have the realm of the physical, right, the concrete, and the mental, which depending on what we want to do might get reduced to the physical, right, if we're physicalists, say. And then we have the realm of the abstract, and that's not necessarily the same. Abstract objects aren't going to be dependent on us. They're not going to be in our heads. Yes?
But if you refer to like God or something, would it be abstract?
That is really going to depend on what conception of God you have. We enter here into muddy theological waters, which I will pass over in silence before I offend somebody. So, last distinction I want to add, last one, has to do with something that actually came up when we were doing ontological quantification implicitly, which is this notion of Occam's razor. So have you come across the idea of Occam's razor before? Is this something we've run into? So the general idea with Occam's razor is it's a methodological principle that tells us when you should prefer one theory or one story over another. And the line is, entities shouldn't be multiplied beyond necessity. That's the fancy way to say, prefer a simpler theory. Always prefer a theory that's simpler. Don't postulate extra, suspects. If you can get away with only one murderer, don't say that there was like 8 dudes here, right? And they all perfectly stabbed in the same place to the same depth. That's why there's only one knife wound. Or it looks like there's only one knife wound. A cheap example, but it gets the idea. So Occam's razor tells us fewer entities is better. Don't overcomplicate. Or to put it in another way, when we're thinking about theory choice, right, which comes back to our ontological commitment stuff, prefer the most parsimonious of theories, the one with the fewest things. Now, parsimony, or this kind of fewer things, actually comes in at least 2 different flavors. And this is the distinction I want to mention to you. So we can distinguish between quantitative parsimony and qualitative parsimony. Quantitative parsimony is literally just fewer entities. Literally just fewer tokens. Qualitative parsimony has fewer types of entity. So here's a cheap example. Right? A quantitatively parsimonious story will have maybe just one object. That's the kind of maximum, well, the maximally is none, but the maximal feasible ontology has one object. It's the blobject. All of us are parts. In fact, we can't be parts because we're not distinct. We're all just sub-portions of the blobject. It's a ridiculous view, but it's a view. That's quantitatively parsimonious. It has one entity. It is going to be qualitatively parsimonious as well because it has very few types. The only type is blobject. All blob, all vibes. But a slightly nicer story, if we come back to, say, our accounts of possible worlds. Lewis's account of possible worlds is quantitatively non-parsimonious. There are a shitload of things. There's all these possible worlds. They're all concrete. They're all out there. They all exist. But it's qualitatively quite parsimonious because all there are concrete objects. Contrast that with our linguistic ersatzer, right? Remember the other view we talked about with worlds? Where there's at least two types of entities. There's concrete things, the big object we're all parts of, and then there's possible worlds, which are these linguistic structures, maximally consistent set of sentences. So the linguistic ersatzer has a better quantitative parsimony, fewer things, but greater qualitative parsimony. They have to postulate at least two different kinds of things. The concrete worlds and the merely linguistic worlds. Do we see the difference between these two different ways to count? So it's basically counting tokens versus counting types?
Does this also map onto set theory? So
A little bit, right? So
lesser sets, or the qualitative is the lesser sets, and then the quantitative less members or subsets.
a maybe better way to think about it is the quantitative is just how many sets do you buy into. The qualitative is how many different fundamental sets do you have. What's your base level that you start with? So, again, quantitative parsimony is just fewer token entities. Qualitative is fewer different types. Now, when we think about accounts of properties, we want to have both of these in mind. Because one story is going to be quantitatively parsimonious or relatively parsimonious at the cost of qualitative abundance. We're going to have multiple types of entities. Or we might go the other way. Let's just have individuals. We just have lots and lots of individuals. Okay. So that's the distinctions I wanted to get through. Now let's turn to the arguments for properties. There's basically three of them. How closely related they are, we'll talk a little bit about. Here's our first one. And this is very Platonic, though the actual formulation of the argument is slightly different. So here's one way we can do it. Premise 1 says something like, look, something needs to explain why claims like 1 through 3 are true. 1 says, fire engine and apple are the same color. 2 says, fire engine and apple have something in common, namely their color. And 3 says, fire engine and apple resemble each other in their color aspects. So again, if we're thinking about a particularly bright apple, bright red apple, and a fire engine, these all seem true. So the challenge is, explain why these three are all true. And the second premise of the one over many argument is, properties are the best explanation for this. What is it to have the same color? It's to have the same property. What is it that the fire engine and Apple have in common? They have the property in common. And how is it, or why is it that the fire engine and the Apple resemble each other? They resemble each other because they have the same property. They share in the same property, in some sense. Properties are the best explanation. So, conclusion. You should believe that properties exist. Properties should be included in our ontology because they help you explain, in fact, they're the best explanation for why claims like 1, 2, and 3 are true. So the structure of this argument is an abductive argument. If you remember that distinction that we talked about way back, it's an inference to the best explanation. Believe in properties because they are the best explainer for why sentences like 1, 2, and 3 are true. And you need to explain why 1, 2, and 3 are true. So here's our one over many argument. So that's our first argument. Let's talk about the second one. Or maybe before we talk about the second one, we should pause. Before we jump ahead, what do we think of this one? It's okay. Do we see the structure? Maybe that's the first thing to ask. Does the structure make sense? Yeah.
So is it basically saying that properties are the best explanation for qualities? Or like any of those?
So qualities would be just substituting another term in, right? Effectively what it's saying is, hey, believing in the existence of these things is going to then give you the tools to explain why 1, 2, and 3 are true.
So it's more a pragmatic thing.
In as much as explanation is always pragmatic, sure.
Because you can say, well, I only believe in it in a way that can explain these things by saying them, but in reality or objective reality can deny them.
Good. So there's a question here about what we mean by explain.
Okay.
Right? And implicit is the thought that this notion of explanation is somehow not just bound up with a particular person at a particular time. Right? Because otherwise a good explanation might be because I say so.
Yeah.
Right? The notion of explanation we're invoking here is something more substantive. It's something like metaphysical explanation, but exactly what that is to just move the bubble in the carpet. Again, the best way to read this is something like postulating these entities gives you an answer for why are 1, 2, and 3 true. And a good kind of universal, generalizable answer. One that any safe, sane, and sober person will accept. That's the kind of thought. So here's our first one. Let's think about our second one. This is, to be honest, this is the one I think that most people, if it motivates them to buying into properties, this is the argument. Right? This is the one that gets them. Here's the second argument. The second argument turns on a very contentious premise about how language works. But it's worth going through. So our first premise says, hey, predicates like is red or is wise are meaningful. I can say things like Socrates is wise, and that actually is a meaningful sentence that expresses something. It's not like me just going blah, 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 blah. There's actual meaning to Socrates is wise. It says something. Similarly, there are a bunch of what we'll call abstract singular terms that look meaningful. I can say things like redness is a color, humility is a virtue, humans are mammals. Right? Where I use terms, redness, humility, human, where I seem to be talking about some general entity. Right? I'm not talking about this is a color, because this is a fucking sweater. Right? So claims like this are meaningful. They might be false, but they're at least meaningful. Now here's the contentious premise. To be meaningful, there must be something that these linguistic items refer to or denote. In order for is red to be meaningful, it must denote something. In order for redness to be meaningful, it must denote something. So what is it they denote? Answer, properties. Properties are the things that are referred to or denoted. So the basic structure is we use these in a meaningful way. If we use these in a meaningful way, they must refer to something. The thing they refer to are properties. So this is, again, driven by this premise. That's a key move here. This idea that there has to be something these terms refer to or denote. And we might push against that. But if we buy it, then this looks like a good argument for the existence of properties. We have to have something that stands in as the object of reference for predicates and the object of reference for abstract singular terms. Put another way to think about these abstract singular terms, we have a process that's called nominalization. We can take an adjective and turn it into a noun by making a name. That's what we're doing when we get these kinds of terms. I have red, and I turn it into redness. So, okay. So there's our second argument. It's basically a semantic or referential argument. Now our last one. We'll do the last one and then we'll go for our break. The last argument actually uses the notion of ontological commitment that we talked about earlier. Right? So, goes like this. Wow. The first premise is we have a number of sentences like the following that are true. These dresses are of the same type. Acquired characteristics are never inherited. Redness is a color, right? Humility is a virtue, etc., etc., etc. What's important about these sentences is that these sentences seem to require, when we regiment them, they look like they're going to require quantification over properties. Take our acquired characteristics are never inherited. Ignore my terrible typos there. This looks like it has to involve quantifying over things that are acquired characteristics. And characteristics are the kinds of things that we think of as properties. It's not like I can say, hey, here's a characteristic. It's right here. It's located there. It's this. If anything is a property, it's going to be something like that. Or again, humility looks like a character trait, a quality a person might have, a property. So the thought is, a number of these sentences are true. They involve quantifying over these various entities. Third premise, hey, good old Quinean story about commitment. What you quantify over is what you're committed to. So, property should be on our ontology. We are committed to properties. The truth of these sentences, once we rigidify them, forces us to quantify over properties. So they got to be in there too. So those are our big three arguments. The one over many, which is that properties are the best explanation for things like resemblance, or resemblance like talk. The referential one that says, hey, we have all this meaningful talk, just to go back, meaningful talk that involves predicates or abstract singular terms. We need to have something that these refer to. Let's use properties. And then a quantificational one. There are some sentences that we cannot paraphrase in such a way where we don't quantify over properties. These three seem to push us to gotta have properties in our ontology. So this leads to the next question, and what we'll talk about after the break. Ooh, wrong arrow. Maybe quick, right? We basically have a sketch where something like the following is what the jobs properties do. They're going to be shared or common. They're going to explain similarities or resemblances. They're going to be the semantic value of predicates, abstract singular terms. They're going to be what we quantify over in those sentences. And something we'll come back to when we talk about identity is maybe they'll explain duplication. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks' time. So these all look like jobs for properties. So question when we come back is, what the hell are they? What the hell are they? And to do that, yeah, we'll come back after the break. So why don't we go until 47? So 10 minutes, give or take? At least 10 minutes from what I can see here. Cool, okay.